So we're going to hear next from Dr. Amelia Bachleda, and to think more and draw our attention now to some of the neurodevelopmental impacts of substances and on brain development. There are impacts on brain development of biological substances for sure, and we remember that in terms of impacts on mother, but as well as on the infants. There are also impacts on the brain of trauma. Early trauma and trauma during the prenatal period as well. So I'd like to now introduce Dr. Bachleda. She is an outreach and education specialist at the University of Washington's Institute for Learning and Brain Science, which is an interdisciplinary research center that focuses on early learning and brain development. Her work is to share the science of early learning with thousands in the early learning community, including parents, childcare providers, educators, and policymakers. And her Ph.D. is in neurobiology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We are delighted to have you with us. Please welcome Dr. Bachleda.
All right, good morning, everybody. It's really my pleasure to be here today. I'm going to see if I can get this technology transfer happening. Let's see. See if that did it. I was trying to get into the mind of the tech support here earlier. All right. Okay. So, my name's Amelia. I'm here from the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences, which is a research institute at the University of Washington in Seattle. And I am not as deeply embedded in the field of maternal wellness, infant mental health, as many of you are here today. And I'm really excited to be here to learn along with you as well. At the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences, we study early childhood learning and brain development. So I'm going to be talking today about brain development. What's going on in those very early periods? I'm going to talk a little bit about how substances interact with that piece. But I think it's so nice that we started the morning hearing from Nancy, thinking about the context, right? Where even if we're talking about neurons or brain cells, right, that exists in a system, that exists in a context. And so I think that was such a lovely way to start. This is my first time in Toronto, and I'm so pleased to be here. This is where my husband was born. His family's from Vancouver Island. So it's nice to be back. I wish he was here with me. So it's my home away from home. So thank you also for having me. All right. So Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences, we're a research institute. There's about 70 of us, and we have this unique team. It's the outreach and education team. That's who I work with, and it's my full-time job to take that research and get it out into the hands of people that can use it, who are working every day to improve the lives of children. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing in that area to support children and families. I so appreciate it. And I think I'm going to talk about brain development in a minute, but we didn't get our break. So I wanted to, if you're up for it, I wanted to start with one of the activities that I might do again tomorrow. So you might see this again tomorrow. But it's actually a research game. And it's a research game that researchers have used to look at executive functioning skills in young children. But it gets us up and moving around. It's going to give us a little bit of a stretch. So if you're willing and able, I would invite you to stand up with me. Now, this is a play on head, shoulders, knees, and toes, okay? So, the idea first here is I'm going to say, please touch your head. And instead of touching your head, I'd like you to touch your toes if you can safely. We're a little motion limited here, so you can just sort of go in that general direction. And when I say touch your toes, please touch your head, okay? All right, touch your toes, touch your toes, touch your head carefully, touch your head, touch your toes. Okay, great. Now we're gonna move on to round two. This is knees and shoulders, same idea. So when I say touch your shoulders, please touch your knees. And when I say touch your knees, please touch your shoulders, okay? Touch your shoulders, touch your shoulders, touch your knees, touch your shoulders, touch your knees. Okay, lovely. Can anybody guess what the third round is? It's all together. I know for those of us that are on West Coast time, this is really an extra challenge. All right, please touch your head, touch your shoulders, touch your knees, touch your shoulders, touch your toes. Thank you very much. Okay, lovely job. Thank you, everybody. I want to give everybody a little bit of a stretch. So this is a research study that researchers actually used to look at children's executive functioning skills. So being able to pay attention and focus, that's what you had to do. You had to think flexibly, right? You had to remember the rules, and you had to inhibit your impulses, do the opposite of what I asked you to do. And these particular researchers found that how well children perform on this particular research test when they're in preschool actually predicts academic outcomes in all areas later on. So these skills are non-trivial, but also it's a great way to get up and stretch. Okay, on to brain development. Thanks for playing along with me. Okay. So brain development, I think everyone in this room knows and is familiar with how quickly the brain develops, right? When children are born, our brains are already about 25% of our adult size. So a huge amount of brain development happens really early. But that's certainly not the end of the story, right? Within the first year of birth, children's brains grow to about 70% of their adult size. That's an incredible amount of growth in that first year. By 5, about 92% of their adult size, and then on to adult. Now we all know, right, we've all spent time with 5-year-olds, 92% of your adult size does not mean 92% done, right? There's still a lot of brain development that's happening. It's just growth, right? There's a huge amount of growth that's happening in these early years. So what is going on inside of the brain in these early years? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, to give you a little bit of context, sort of the 101 of learning, right? We're born with these brains that are already very large, and we're born with most of the brain cells or neurons that we're ever going to have, about 86 billion of them, right? But all of those 86 billion neurons, they haven't formed all the connections or synapses yet. And that's important because every time we learn something new, we either build a physical new connection between those cells in our brain or we make those connections stronger, right? Children have an immense amount to learn. They have to learn how to be experts at living their own lives. And so there's a huge amount of foundational architecture of building our brains that happens in these very early years. Okay, so we're going to go today and talk about brain development, and we're going to talk about it in a series of stages. And at each stage, I'm going to talk about a few different pieces. I'm going to talk about substances here and there, but just to give you sort of a general overview of what's going on in these very early years of period and years in brain development. You'll also notice that brain development really spans all of childhood, adolescence, and even into adulthood. This isn't something that happens at a very confined period in our early years. It's a process that happens over the course of our lives in the context of relationships. Okay. So this very first phase in brain development, it's called neurulation, which is the formation of the nervous system. And remembering the word neurulation, if you want to, fine, doesn't really matter. I bring it up mostly to say that this very early, the nervous system begins to form very early in brain development, often before women know that they're pregnant. And yes, substances can interfere at these very early stages, but this is complicated too. A while ago, a couple years ago, the Center for Disease Control in the United States put out this huge public information campaign. Maybe you saw it. And they were trying to get at this idea that the nervous system begins to form very early, and that any woman that could possibly ever become pregnant should never consume any alcohol. They got a lot of pushback for that, right? That's not thinking about the context. It's taking away, it's saying that women can't make their own decisions, right? So this is complex. You always have to think about context. Sure, there can be some effects at this early period. The nervous system is beginning to form at this early period, but there's context to all these things. Okay, so we're talking about the nervous system. What do we mean? What is our nervous system? And for some of this information, you may very well be familiar with it. I'm hoping today to also give you some context of different ways to think about it too. I serve in this sort of science translation role. How can we talk about these different topics in different ways? So the nervous system, right? It is the way in which we understand the world. And it's broken down into two basic systems. Our peripheral nervous system that flows throughout our body, that's taking in information from the world, right? And that is all flown to our central nervous system through our spinal cord and to our brain that processes that information and helps us decide what we're going to do with all of the different sensory information. And I wanted to share a quick video with you that is kind of fun, and I think that it is a really nice example of one of the things that our nervous system does for us, right? Our nervous system does a lot of things, but it's kind of a fun look at how it works for us and what it's doing. Okay. So we'll see if I can get this to... Oops. Okay, so I'm going to play this video, and your goal is to try and figure out who committed the crime. It's a murder mystery, okay?
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
Why, madam?
It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
Action.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
Okay, so did anybody catch the 21 changes? And did anyone have this sort of reaction as you're watching the video, as one YouTube commenter did, Miss Anonymous Annie? Okay, so I think that's a clever campaign that was done actually to think about road safety and to think about particular pedestrians and cyclists, right? If you're not looking, you might not see it. And I use it because I think it's kind of a lovely example of what our nervous system does for us, right? We asked our nervous system to do a task, to figure out who committed the murder, who committed that crime, right? And so we're able to focus in and think about that. Even though our brain probably registered or at least we saw those changes, right? We physically saw those changes. We didn't register them in our brain, right? It wasn't brought up to our consciousness. And so that is a big job of our nervous system, to figure out what's important in the world, to filter out what's not. And to a large extent, what we experience in our conscious mind is pulled through this filtering system, right? And what comes in is going to drive, and what our attention is, what the context in is going to drive our understanding of the world and how we respond. To give sort of this a little bit left field example, think about how different experiences in the world and also different sensory perceptions might influence how you experience your everyday life, right? So has anybody ever been walking their dog and the dog stopped and was smelling a patch of grass before? They're so interested in that patch of grass, right? Do you think if you got down on your hands and knees and smelled as hard as you could, do you think you could smell anything in that patch of grass? Probably not, right? We don't have that sensory perception. We don't have that window into the world that dogs do. I once heard someone describe how dogs live simultaneously in the past. They can smell what's been there, in the present, and in the future they can smell what's coming, which is kind of interesting. And it's interesting to think about what would life be like to have that sensory perception. And so then I think it's also interesting to think about, what about infants? What are they perceiving? How are their brains making sense of the world? And how might that be different than what our brains are perceiving and making sense of? That's our nervous system that's allowing us to have that specialization. Okay, so moving on to the next phase of brain development, thinking about the period in which many neurons are being born. So neurons are the building blocks of our brains. There are brain cells. We have about 86 billion of them. And these you can think of as our body's communication team, right? And we have neurons in our brains, and we also have them throughout our bodies. So not just in our brains, also in our bodies. And together they form this really complex network. And that network, the foundational network, is set up in early childhood, but it's tweaked by our experiences as we go through our lives. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And I wanted to show this video that goes through some of the parts of the neuron. So how do neurons work? So there's three main parts of a neuron. There's the dendrites, which are like this crazy hairdo, and they take in information from the world. There's the cell body that processes that information, and there's the axon that takes the processed information and sends it down along the path. Many neurons are also myelinated, which helps to increase the speed of the signaling. Now, neurons never work alone. They always have buddies. And in between neurons are connections or synapses. And this is where the electrical signals that travel within neurons are changed to a chemical signal. A single neuron can receive many different inputs. Some of those inputs might say, send a message. Some of those inputs might say, don't send a message. And together, that cell body, that it crushes that information, figures out, okay, I am going to send a message. That electrical signal travels down to the end of the neuron, where it gets translated to a chemical message that can cross in between the tiny, tiny space between the cells, and then get sent along to the next neuron. Would anybody like to see that video one more time? We good? Okay. So I wanted to spend some time talking about the synapse, which is that site in between neurons, right? Okay, so all of our neurons, they work by sending tiny, tiny electrical signals. And those electrical signals have to hop in between neurons. And in order to do that, they go through a connection, the synapse. So the electrical activity travels down the length of the cell body, reaches the synapse, and at the site of the synapse, this electrical signal triggers the release of what are called neurotransmitters. These are tiny chemical signals that are able to transport the space in between neurons. Once the electrical signal reaches the end of the neuron, it signals the release of these neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters go across the tiny space and then trigger the next neuron to be able to carry on that message. There's also other agents at work here that sort of play cleanup. They pull out those extra neurotransmitters in the system. And we have a lot of these synapses. trillions of synapses. I wanted to show you a picture from one neuron in the brain. So there you can see the cell body is kind of that large shape in blue. And all of those teeny bright yellow and red dots, those are the synapses that are on a single neuron. Each neuron has about 7,000 synapses, which is incredible, right? We have 86 billion neurons in our brain. Each neuron has about 7,000 connections. Who's really good at math and can crunch those numbers for me? No, I'm just kidding. A huge amount of connections. And these are the connections that we're forming over the course of our lives, that we're making tiny changes to as we're learning something new, as we're building skills throughout our lives. I also wanted to point out that we have many different types of neurons too. There isn't just one type of neuron, there's many different types of neurons in our brains. There's a couple main types that are very frequent, but there are all sorts of different types of neurons that do all sorts of different jobs. And these different neurons all use different types of neurotransmitters. So some neurotransmitters up here you've probably heard of before. Dopamine, you've probably heard of before. A smaller subset of neurons in our brain use dopamine to communicate, to send those messages between that synapse. Not all neurons do. The most common neurotransmitters in the brain are glutamate and GABA, and these are the two main neurotransmitters of the brain, but there are many other types as well. It's not important that we know all of the different types. I think it's just sort of interesting to know that there are many different types, and they act in different ways. Okay, so if we're thinking about substances and substance use in the brain specifically, this is the site where the majority of substances act. It's at the site of neurotransmission in between synapses. So substances are going to modify how one neuron talks to another, and they do it in a variety of different ways, but typically the result is that there's going to be more signaling. There's going to be a higher signal of that neurotransmitter. It's going to be, I like to think of it sort of as if you're turning up the volume, right? There's this louder signal all of a sudden. And I also like to think about it, and I also want to note that our brains, you know, we often, there's this sort of idea out there that when addiction happens, that there's it's a disorder of the brain, right? We heard about that earlier, so that's one way that this is looked at. But I think it's important to know that our brains are really smart. They're working for us. What they're doing is that when there's that signal boost, that signal gets turned up, our brains recognize that's not the sort of, that's not an even signaling. I'm going to make changes to this synapse. The brain makes physical changes to these synapses to try and regulate that, to pull down the signaling, to turn down that volume. And what that means is two things. One, in order to have that really high volume experience, perhaps a person who's using substances is going to have to use more substances because the brain has made changes to compensate. And two, when that substance isn't there, because there's been physical changes to those synapses, it's going to be really challenging. There's that biological lack of signaling that's happening. But it's also important to remember that the brain made those changes to reduce, to turn down the volume, and the brain is fully capable of being able to change back in the other direction. Now that's thinking about an adult brain, right? If we're thinking about development, when many of these synapses are forming for the first time, you can imagine how messing with this volume control of having higher signaling or lower signaling could disrupt how neurons are connecting in the very early years of life, and how they might disrupt how the foundational architecture of the brain is getting constructed. But it's complicated, right? It's complicated, and we're also looking at this sort of in lack of any context. This is a figure from a recent review looking at all of the different stages where substances could possibly, potentially disrupt brain development. When exactly is not important, just to say that there are a lot of different phases. So when a substance is used in pregnancy, how much a substance is used in pregnancy, which substance it is, all of these are going to create different factors and affect the developing brain in a variety of different ways. It's very hard to say X amount of substance at B time is going to create Y outcome. It's a challenge. It's this network, right? And I think it's also really important to think about that stigma, the stigma of a certain substance, doesn't necessarily equal increased harm, right? There's been a lot of messaging over the years of the impact of different substances that isn't necessarily true. This is a really great review if you're interested in learning more about the outcomes of substance use at different points in pregnancy and different substances. And I pulled a few different quotes. Now, in the 1980s, at least in the United States, there was this whole scare about the use of crack cocaine, and it got blown out of proportion. There was a lot of racism that was involved in the messaging about who was using these drugs and what was happening. And one of the pieces here to remember is that researchers have found that poverty is complicated. I think it's better to think about context. Context is more powerful influence on the outcome of children than gestational exposure to cocaine, right? There's a lot that's going on here. We can't just say that cocaine is leading to X, Y, and Z outcomes, and there are other factors, trauma, other things that are going on that could be a much more powerful influencer on a child's development than cocaine. Whereas something like alcohol, and it's also important to think about context with alcohol, of course, but alcohol can disturb fetal development, especially affecting the nervous system, with potential lifelong consequences sort of at any point in development, right? So the stigma of the drug doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to create or cause more disruption in the development. And again, context is key here, right? It's impossible to pull these pieces apart. Okay. So the nervous system has been formed. We've made a bunch of brain cells. They're starting to communicate. They're using that synaptic connection to communicate and to set up and to figure out who they're going to connect with, how we're going to form the most complex network that is known. And then cells also have to migrate, right? They have to find their appropriate places in the brain. Our brain is made of multiple different zones, and this helps to a certain extent determine function, right? We were talking about executive functioning earlier. A lot of executive functioning is located in our prefrontal cortex in the frontal lobe. But while there are also multiple zones, the brain functions as a network. Right? It's all interconnected. There's neural connections between the sides of our brains. There's functional connections between functional nodes of our brain. It's working as a network, and context is important here as well. One of these studies is actually scientists, there's this sort of pervasive thought of either being a left brain person or a right brain person. Has anybody heard that before? So it's not necessarily the case, right? We use both sides of our brain. And so this was a study that scientists were trying to set out to indicate that, that our brains are more interconnected than they are between hemispheres than they are not. And that is what they showed. And I think, side note of the left brain, right brain, I think sometimes thinking about left brain, right brain can also, we're removing the context, right? Let's say you're really good at art. You might say, oh, I'm right-brained. Well, maybe you've probably been doing art since you're a very little child, and you've been practicing over and over and over and over again. You've had all of those experiences that have built your abilities, right? Just as someone who might do math, which is sort of thought of as a left brain thing. Maybe they were playing with blocks and doing secret math problems, and they built those abilities over time. And to say that you're right-brained or left-brained also sells yourself a little bit short. It's not to say that you can't learn to, quote, left-brain activity or, quote, right-brain activity as an adult. We always can. We have this amazing ability to learn throughout our lives. Okay, left brain, right brain, soapbox over. So this next phase of brain development that happens starting about 20 weeks in gestation and goes all the way through adolescence is this process of synaptogenesis, or making those connections between the cells in our brains, right? We're born with all of these many different cells, and the cells have to figure out how to connect, how to make these really amazing networks in our brain, how to communicate, and how to figure out how to do so in a meaningful way. We make trillions of these connections, as I mentioned, right? 86 billion brain cells. Each brain cell makes up to 7,000 connections. That's trillions and trillions and trillions of connections. And the experiences that we have in our lives, particularly our early experiences, impact how these connections form, right? The more often we have an experience, whether that experience is a good experience or a bad experience, the stronger those connections are going to be in our brains. We have this capacity throughout our lives, but early in development is when many of these connections are forming for the first time. And so it's this time of sort of amazing possibility in brain development. Now, I brought a little activity along with me, and I want to take a minute to look at more closely at how this process of making connections in our brain looks over the course of development. So you should have, and let me know if you don't, I passed out some of these cards earlier, and you can work in groups of 2 or 3. Raise your hand if no one has access to them. Okay. Okay, that's all I have. Talk to Buddy if you don't have them. And what I'd like you to do, on these cards are a picture of what a tiny, tiny piece of the brain looks like at different points in development, okay? Starting with a newborn brain and going all the way up to 6 years. Remember that we're born with most of our brain cells, which are sort of those big globby portions illustrated, but not all of the connections. Those are those lines that are forming between. And what I'd like you to do is to put them in order. From newborn all the way to 6 years. We start with all of the brain cells that we're ever going to have, but all of the connections, which are illustrated as lines, we don't have all of those yet. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. So it should be
All right, how's everybody doing? Give you another few seconds to wrap up your conversations. Alrighty, let's come back together. And what I'd like you to do is we'll reveal these one by one. And let's start with everybody's hand up. And when we get to one that maybe you didn't put in the same order as I have, we'll take our hands down. And I will say that this is very tricky, and I probably would not get all of them right if I did not know the right answer, right? Okay, so starting with newborn. All right, okay. Heading on to 1 month. All right, 3 months. All right. 6 months, it starts getting tricky. Okay. 1 year. Okay. 2 years. 4 years. And 6 years. Okay, are there any up here that are particularly surprising? 4 and 6 years. Yeah. Yeah, so there are fewer connections in the brain of a 6-year-old than there are of a 4-year-old. Does anybody know what this process is called? I've heard of it before. Pruning, right. So we are learning so much in our first few years of life that our brains actually overproduce the amount of connections that we need. The latest estimate is that the growing brain between 0 and 3 makes about 1 million new neuronal connections each second, which is an incredible amount of new physical connections to make each second in the brain, right? That is a lot of work that the little ones are doing in their brains every day. And they make so many connections that they make too many, right? And you can think about it a little bit like caring for a rose bush, right? At first, our brains are blooming. They're making all of these connections. But after a period of time, there might be too many connections. Or if you think about a rose bush at the end of the season, maybe there's some branches that are a little unwieldy. And so we prune them, we cut them back. And that results in a rose bush or a brain that is really healthy and thriving. The connections that we don't need, that we don't use as children, those are removed, and the ones that remain are stronger, right? It leads to a more efficient brain. This is the process that helps us to become experts at living our own lives. And this also re-emphasizes the importance of context of relationships, right? Because what experiences we have, who we are, learning to become what we are in the world, what communities we're a part of, that is impacting how our very early brain development is shaping and forming. And most of this happens long after pregnancy, right? These are little ones out in the world, shaping the foundational architecture of their brain. I'll share an animation just to give you a sense of what this looks like as well on sort of the biological level. So we have our little friends, these group of neurons before, and let's say there's one signaling pathway, one behavior that a child's doing over and over and over again. Maybe it's a language that they're learning. They're using that pathway of neurons over and over and over again. And the more they use that pathway, the more they stimulate that, the stronger the connection between those particular neurons are going to be. It actually gets physically stronger, bigger, more signaling is happening. Whereas another experience, maybe let's say the experience of hearing a language that they only hear in passing every once in a while. That's not an experience that they have very often. That's not going to create a very strong connection between those cells in the brain. And maybe that extra little connection that was there for a minute is going to become smaller and shrink. Now, I think it's also important to remember that this isn't necessarily neurons going away. It's just changes to the microarchitecture of how cells are connecting in our brains. And again, we can change how these cells are connected in our brains at any point, right? If we couldn't, there'd be no reason for us all to be here together, right? As we're learning together, we're making tiny changes to how the cells connect in our brains. right? But it's so much easier as children to do this when we're setting up all of the grand structure of our brain. One of the examples that I think is really lovely, and perhaps you've heard this story or this study before, but they wanted to see how experiences in our adult lives changed our brains, right? Because there is so much focus on children. And what they did is these researchers looked at the brains of taxi cab drivers in London. And this was before GPS or smartphones. And there's an extensive test that taxi cab drivers had to pass to really be able to understand fluently the streets of London. And what they found was taxi cab drivers actually had a larger portion of their brain devoted to wayfinding. They could see a physical difference in their brain. Their brains, this tiny portion of their brains expanded as they learned this really integrated map of London. And so we're able at any point in our lives to change how our brains respond. And so I wanted to sort of invite this reflection of how do you think your experiences that you've had have changed your own brain, right? That's one of the beauty of having a brain, that they can be specialized to us, to living our own lives, to being part of who we are, to be part of our communities, shaped by the experiences that we have. Okay, one last piece of brain development that I wanted to cover, and I wanted to bring it up because I think this is a fun one, and it's a part of development that extends all the way into adulthood and ends in our early 30s. And it's this process of making neuronal signaling more efficient. So neurons, as we've been talking about, some neurons, many neurons are wrapped in this fatty insulating substance that's called myelin. This is one of the reasons why young infants need to have such a high-fat diet, because they're doing so much work myelinating the cells in their brain and the cells in their body that's going to allow for really efficient neural transmission. That's super important. A lot of that high fat is going to this myelination. And so what does myelin do for us? Well, it helps make that signaling faster and more efficient. And I wanted to give you an example of this. And I hope no one has ever had this experience, but I think we all have. Okay, have you ever been cooking before and you've grabbed a handle of a pan that is too hot, right? Okay, and then you've released it, and before you felt that it was painful, you probably released it, right? If you think about it, you release that really fast before you register the sensation of pain, right? So the neural tract that takes the information that says something is hot is myelinated, but the tract that gives us information about pain, that something is painful, is not myelinated. And so that millisecond difference is the difference between having a tract that's myelinated that goes really fast to our brain that tells us immediately to drop that, because that's really important. We need to drop that or let go of it before we do any significant harm to our skin, to our flesh. And that painful ouch signal, that's important too, but we don't need that as quickly. So it's not myelinated in the brain. And over time, this myelination adds up together to create a much more efficient system in the brain. And work at our lab has shown how these systems of myelination develop over time. So this is a representation of some of the core connective tracts in the brain, the corpus callosum, which is those neural connections that connect the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. And in an infant, we have a certain percentage of the brain that's coded in this insulating fibers. And as a 5-year-old, that increases over that period of time. Those connections get more efficient, they get myelinated, they get insulated, they work faster and faster. And as an adult, we have much more of our neuronal tracts insulated. And I also think that this is another interesting thing to keep in mind too, right? As adults, our brains literally send messages faster, right? We have more myelination. We can think at a faster pace than sometimes these young infants and children do as they're working on myelinating their brain. Another theory that neuroscientists have is that myelination, completing myelination that happens in our early 30s kind of closes out that huge wave of brain development. Once a neuron is myelinated, it becomes harder to change its connections, right? And so that early period is that period where we're most able to learn new things, right? It's one of the reasons why it's so much easier to learn a language when we're a child than it is as an adult. We have to work a lot harder, do things more and more and more in order to be able to change our brains at that later point. And the experiences we have also influence these white matter tracks as well. So the more often we do something, this particular study looked at piano players. They saw that they had thicker and more efficiently myelinated tracks in parts of their brain that were important for motor control, for looking, for controlling their fingers as they were moving over the keys. And so they could see physical changes in their brain too as a result of the experiences that they have. So our brains really are the combination of biology and our experiences, the context that we're living in, right? We're born with a particular set of brain cells, the ability to make connections, but how those connections form, which connections form, that's influenced by the experiences that we have in our lives. And so I really do like this metaphor of building our brains, right? We build our brains throughout the course of our life. And that can be affected by all sorts of different things. Certainly substances can be a part of this picture, but there's so much more than that as well, right? If we're thinking about brain growth, I hope that you have a little more of a window into what are all the different pieces that are happening in this really early period of development. All of the different cells that are making connections based on the experiences that we're having. And I wanted to leave you with a thought that I think is all too familiar to everyone in this room, right? We learn in the context of relationships. It's all about the relationships that we have in our lives. And I wanted to share 2 studies from the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences that look at these early pieces of relationship. So one of the co-directors of the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences is Dr. Andy Meltzoff, and he's been thinking about children for a very long time. And one of his very earliest experiments that he did back in the 70s was to go and make faces at babies, newborn babies in the hospital. He got permission to do so. And what he found is that many babies, not all babies, will make those faces right back, right? So even from our earliest moment, we're born wanting to be part of this conversation, right? We're born wanting to interact, wanting to learn, wanting to build those relationships and build on that relationship that the child already has with their parent, right? We've moved on since the 70s and have come up with some more complex methods than making faces at babies. And recently, Dr. Meltzoff and his lab have been really interested in touch, right? Touch is one of the very earliest ways that we have to really communicate and interact with newborns, right? And so his group was interested in seeing how are the brains of infants set up? Do they experience touch like an adult? And so they had simple touches to their hands and to their feet while they're in this brain imaging machine, which is called magnetoencephalography, which allows us to get a millisecond by millisecond picture of what is going on in the brain. And sure enough, he found that infants really have a pretty complex sense of touch. They understand touch in their brain much like adults do. They have a specific area of their brain that responds when their hands touch, a specific area of their brain that responds when their foot's touched. And that's really cool, but that's not all he found. He also found that infants, these are about 7-month-old, their brains responded in similar areas and in similar ways when they saw a video of an adult's hand being touched, an adult's foot being touched, which suggests at this very early age that infants are already able to make these connections between other people's experiences in the world and their own, right? This deep connection that I think all of us know have been there for a really long time, and some of these scientists are just getting around to seeing it in the brains for the first time. So these early relationships are setting up the foundation to all learning. And just to sort of summarize what I've been talking about today, brain development occurs over many stages and over many years, right? Our brains are this combination of the biology that we have as well as our experiences, and that learning happens in the context of relationships. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure to spend it with you. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the day and to continue learning, continue to building connections in my brain. And I want to make sure that we have our break. So with that, have a great rest of your day.
So I want to thank you so much for sharing a lot of really complex information in such a clear and understandable way. You're perfect for your job. And as I was talking just before, we will get a break. I just, as I was hearing you talk, I really was thinking about a couple of things with respect to specifically women and young children who are substance involved. And the first really was sort of to remember that biology and how much early experience and actually the prenatal experience, both for the moms and the babies, affects, the structure and the function of the brain, and how important that early experience is for both. And, ideally, and how important it is for us to pay attention to trauma and stress in that early experience. Not only the impact of the actual biological impact of the brain, but of the substance, but also just the trauma piece. And also I wanted to, I'm really glad that you talked about neuroplasticity, because neuroplasticity is the reason for hopefulness in all of the work that we do in terms of impacts on kids and for mothers, because I was thinking of the mother's brain and the baby's brain at the same time, right? Because that mother's brain was that baby's brain. And neuroplasticity, ideally, we're working in the early childhood field to make those changes, but gives us hope that all brains can be changed through relationship, even traumatized brains, and that through our interactions and relationships in early childhood, but all through the lifespan with the families that we work with, we can affect changes in the brain that helps people function and respond and heal from the biological impacts of substance use and of trauma. So I really thank you for that.